The Pacific could look peaceful even in wartime. From a distance, the water stretched out in long, slow swells, the surface reflecting a sky that carried no sign of urgency. There were no trenches, no ruined cities, no visible lines of battle. To the untrained eye, it was an empty ocean. But beneath that calm surface lay one of the most dangerous hunting grounds of the war, an invisible battlefield where steel moved in silence and decisions were made without warning. Into those waters sailed a single destroyer, a vessel not built for fame. It was fast, lightly armored, and practical in its design, meant to escort larger ships, screen formations, and respond to threats before they grew too close. In the hierarchy of naval power, destroyers were rarely the center of attention. They were the escorts, the protectors, the ones assigned to the edges of the formation where danger usually appeared first. No one aboard expected distinction. The mission was routine by wartime standards, escort duty through contested waters where submarines had been reported. The task was simple on paper: watch the horizon, scan the waves, and keep the larger ships safe. It was not the kind of assignment that produced headlines. It was the kind that filled logbooks with uneventful hours and quiet tension. Submarine threat reports dominated the region's planning rooms. Intelligence summaries spoke of torpedoes striking without warning, of ships vanishing into the sea within minutes. The enemy was rarely seen. It was felt instead through sonar echoes, sudden explosions, and the long stretches of silence in between. Every escort mission carried the same underlying truth: the danger was probably there, even if it could not be seen. On deck, the crew sensed that tension, but not destiny. They checked equipment, monitored instruments, and followed procedures that had become familiar through repetition. Conversations were brief, practical, and quiet. No one spoke of history or turning points. They spoke of bearings, fuel levels, and the next watch rotation. Nothing in the intelligence briefing suggested that this patrol would be different from dozens of others. No intercepted messages hinted at a major encounter. No predictions pointed toward the destroyer's course. The ocean ahead looked as empty as ever. And yet, somewhere beneath that calm surface, a silent adversary was already moving into position. The hunt had begun, and neither side had announced it. The contact appeared as a faint shape on the sonar screen, an interruption in the steady rhythm of the sea. There was no alarm bell, no dramatic announcement. The operator leaned closer, adjusted the controls, and listened again. The echo returned, consistent, deliberate, and moving. It did not drift like debris. It did not scatter like fish. It held its course like something alive and mechanical beneath the surface. The report moved quietly up to the bridge. Possible submarine contact. Bearing steady. Range uncertain. The destroyer's officers did not react with excitement. They had seen contacts before, and many of them false, some of them real. Procedure mattered more than optimism. The ship altered course with a measured turn, engine shifting tone as they lined up for the run. Depth charges were prepared without ceremony. Sailors rolled them into position, hand steady, movements practiced. No one spoke of victory. Depth charge attacks were often acts of faith, explosions dropped into darkness, guided by echoes that might vanish at any moment. The destroyer passed over the estimated position. Charges slipped into the sea, one after another, disappearing beneath the surface. A few seconds later, the ocean erupted. Tall columns of water climbed into the air, white and violent against the morning light. The blast rolled outward in heavy waves, then collapsed back into the sea. For a moment, the water churned as if disturbed by some unseen force. Then it settled. The surface smoothed itself, returning to the same quiet motion it had carried before the attack. Only the echo of the explosions lingered in memory. Silence followed. Sonar operators listened intently, searching for the familiar return that would signal a surviving submarine. But the screen showed nothing. The contact had vanished. No movement. No course. Just an empty patch of ocean beneath the destroyer's keel. Then came the first sign. A dark sheen spread across the surface, thin at first, then widening into an unmistakable pattern. Oil. It rose slowly, carried upward by the water that had swallowed the submarine moments earlier. Soon, small pieces of debris followed, fragments of wood, bits of metal, silent evidence of what had been below. Confirmation arrived without celebration. The sonar contact was gone. The oil kept spreading. One submarine had been destroyed. The crew watched in silence. They had followed procedure. They had done what they were trained to do. One submarine was gone, and no one yet understood that the ocean beneath them held more than one target. The first kill was entered into the logbook with the same measured language used for course changes and fuel checks. Time, coordinates, estimated depth, confirmation by oil and debris. The entry was precise, factual, and almost understated. In command reports, it was treated as a single successful engagement, important but not extraordinary. Submarine contacts were expected in these waters. A destroyer destroying one was considered part of its function. To higher command, it appeared as an isolated event. A brief interruption in an otherwise routine patrol. There was no immediate reassignment, no sudden change in orders. The destroyer was told to continue its escort duties and maintain vigilance. One submarine loss did not, in theory, alter the strategic picture. Beneath the surface, the wider Japanese submarine force continued its operations. Patrol routes remained unchanged. Messages traveled through the usual channels. The absence of one vessel did not immediately signal a larger danger. Submarines were expected to disappear occasionally. War at sea was full of such silences. On board the destroyer, there was little celebration. The crew understood how uncertain submarine warfare could be. One success did not guarantee another. Instead of boasting, they focused on routine. Sonar operators refined their listening patterns. Depth charge crews checked their equipment more carefully. Bridge officers reviewed procedures with quiet discipline. Fatigue began to accumulate alongside that vigilance. Submarine patrols rarely allowed for deep rest. Watches rotated through the long hours of night and day, each shift carrying the same tension. Every faint sonar return demanded attention. Every unusual ripple in the water could signal danger. The mind learned to expect threats even when the sea appeared empty. The ocean offered no pause for reflection. The destroyer moved steadily through its assigned waters, cutting a narrow wake across a vast, indifferent surface. Days blended together, sunrise, watch rotation, sonar sweeps, engine noise, then darkness again. The rhythm of the patrol replaced the memory of the first engagement. But something had quietly begun. The logbook recorded only one submarine destroyed. The crew sensed only the continuation of their mission. Yet beneath the surface, unseen contacts were already moving into range. The clock had started running, though no one on board knew exactly what it was counting down toward. In the early years of the Pacific War, the submarine carried a quiet authority. It was not the largest vessel, nor the most visible, but it possessed an advantage that surface ships could never match: concealment. Japanese naval doctrine treated submarines as force multipliers, tools that could disrupt supply lines, weaken formations, and strike without warning. One submarine, properly placed, could threaten an entire convoy. Early results seemed to confirm that faith. Allied shipping losses mounted across vast stretches of ocean. Transports, tankers, and even warships were struck by torpedoes launched from unseen attackers. Reports spoke of ships exploding without warning, of crews abandoning decks still warm from engine heat. The ocean, once treated as a highway, began to resemble an ambush site. In this environment, the submarine was cast as the predator. It moved silently beneath the surface, patient and unseen, choosing its moment. Destroyers, by contrast, appeared reactive. They rushed toward contacts, dropped charges into the dark, and hoped for confirmation. The submarine hunted by design. The destroyer responded by necessity. The numbers reinforced that perception. Submarines could disperse across wide patrol areas, covering shipping lanes that stretched for thousands of miles. Escort vessels, on the other hand, were tied to convoys and predictable routes. They protected, but they did not control. Beneath the surface, the hunter enjoyed freedom of movement. Above it, the escort followed a schedule. Technological confidence deepened that belief. Japanese submarines were considered reliable and capable, their torpedoes powerful, their crews disciplined. Training emphasized patience and precision. Commanders trusted their boats to operate independently for long periods, striking when the opportunity appeared. The system seemed balanced in their favor. Small escorts were rarely treated as serious threats. A single destroyer, lightly armored and bound to escort duty, did not appear capable of changing the equation. Anti-submarine warfare was seen as a defensive measure, not a decisive strategy. The destroyer's role was to discourage attacks, not to dominate the battlefield beneath the waves. Over time, this confidence hardened into expectation. Submarines would continue to operate with relative freedom. Shipping losses would remain part of the war's rhythm. The balance between hunter and hunted seemed settled. What few considered was how fragile that balance could be, how quickly it might shift if one small escort began to turn the hunt in the opposite direction. In naval planning rooms, destroyers rarely occupied the center of the map. They were drawn around the edges of formations, thin lines circling larger shapes that represented carriers, cruisers, and transports. Their purpose was protective, not dramatic. They were built to escort, to screen, to react. In the hierarchy of naval warfare, destroyers were not expected to become legends. Their size alone limited their reputation. Destroyers were fast and agile, but they lacked the heavy armor and long-range firepower of larger warships. Their fuel reserves were smaller. Their quarters were tighter. They were built for movement and response, not for independent dominance. In official language, they were described as escorts, pickets, and patrol vessels, roles defined more by duty than by distinction. The crews who served on them were trained with the same practicality. Endurance mattered more than heroics. Long watches, repetitive sonar sweeps, and the constant awareness of unseen threats shaped their routines. The destroyer's war was not one of grand engagements, but of steady vigilance. Hours of quiet could be broken by seconds of danger, and then the silence would return. Command measured a destroyer's success in indirect terms. If the convoy arrived safely, the destroyer had done its job. If the carrier group remained intact, the escort had performed its duty. There were no grand victories to announce, only the absence of loss. In that sense, success was often invisible, defined by what did not happen. Individual ships were rarely treated as unique. Destroyers were produced in classes designed to be interchangeable. If one was lost, another would take its place. Their names mattered to the crews aboard them, but in strategic planning they were units in a larger equation. Replaceable, practical, and necessary. Innovation was not expected at this level. New tactics and technologies were usually associated with carriers, submarines, or major fleet operations. The destroyer's role was to execute established procedures, not to redefine them. It followed orders, guarded routes, and responded to contacts. Nothing more was asked of it. Modesty defined the mission. The destroyer did not seek the spotlight. It moved quietly through dangerous waters, its wake fading behind it as the larger ships carried on. And in that quiet role, few could imagine that one such vessel was about to rewrite the expectations placed upon it. Beneath the surface of the Pacific, the war followed a different rhythm. Japanese submariners lived in a world of dim lights, narrow corridors, and the constant pressure of the ocean above them. It was a confined existence, but it carried a quiet confidence. Their vessels had proven effective. Their tactics, practiced again and again, had yielded results. Convoys had been scattered. Transports had been lost. Warships had taken unexpected hits. Each successful patrol added another layer of assurance. The submarine, silent and unseen, seemed to confirm its place as the dominant hunter of the Pacific. Their methods were familiar by now. Approach at depth. Listen for propellers. Calculate course and speed. Rise into position, fire, then slip away beneath the surface before escorts could respond. The sequence had been practiced in exercises and refined in real combat. It worked often enough to feel reliable. Escorts, especially smaller destroyers, were observed and catalogued. Their speeds, their patrol patterns, their reactions to sonar contacts, all of it became part of the submariner's understanding of the enemy. A lone destroyer did not appear threatening. It was fast, but predictable. It could react, but it rarely surprised. In reports and conversations, such ships were described as obstacles, not dangers. Patterns began to form. Certain approaches led to success. Certain convoy routes produced targets. Certain escort behaviors could be anticipated. The ocean, vast as it was, started to feel familiar. The same procedures produced the same outcomes, and repetition slowly turned confidence into habit. Inside the submarine, the sea seemed almost cooperative. Sound traveled through it in predictable ways. Temperature layers offered concealment. Depth provided safety. Calculations about risk did not change much from one patrol to the next. The assumptions that guided their actions remained steady, unchallenged by anything unusual. Overconfidence did not arrive dramatically. It settled in quietly, like the steady hum of machinery that crews eventually stopped noticing. Success became expected. Patrols were approached with professionalism, but without the sense that the balance might suddenly shift. Somewhere above them, destroyers continued their escort duties, small, practical ships moving along predictable routes. To the submariners, they were part of the environment, not a decisive threat. What they did not realize was that one of those modest escorts was beginning to alter the pattern they trusted, one contact at a time. Life aboard the destroyer settled into a pattern of listening. Sonar became the ship's primary sense, a quiet pulse sent into the depths and returned as echoes that had to be interpreted. The crew learned quickly that the ocean spoke in fragments. A faint return might be a submarine, or it might be a shifting current, a patch of disturbed water, or the hull of a distant ship. Under that pressure, interpretation became a skill as important as the machinery itself. Sonar operators leaned over their equipment, headphones pressed tight, learning to distinguish between the subtle differences in sound. Some echoes felt alive, steady, deliberate, and mechanical. Others carried the uneven rhythm of natural movement. Each contact demanded a decision, and each decision carried consequences. False contacts were common. The destroyer would maneuver into position, depth charges ready, only to find the echo dissolve into silence. At first, those moments felt like wasted effort. But over time, they became part of the learning process. Each mistake revealed something about the ocean's behavior, about the way sound moved through water, about how easily assumptions could mislead. Fatigue complicated everything. Long watches blurred the edges of concentration. The constant hum of engines, the steady motion of the ship, and the endless sweep of the sonar created a kind of mental fog. Judgment became harder to trust. A contact that sounded clear at the start of a shift might seem uncertain hours later. The sea offered no rest, and the destroyer could not afford to miss what lay beneath it. Officers began to emphasize observation over assumption. They reminded the crew that the ocean did not follow expectations. A contact had to be verified, tracked, and understood before action was taken. Procedures became more deliberate. Bearings were checked twice. Courses were plotted with greater care. The ship's response grew less reactive and more precise. With each engagement, reaction times improved. The crew learned how quickly a contact could change depth or direction. They practiced the sequence of detection, maneuver, and depth charge deployment until it felt almost automatic. What had once required hesitation and discussion began to unfold with quiet efficiency. Discipline slowly replaced luck. Success was no longer treated as a fortunate accident. It became the result of sharper listening, better coordination, and more careful decisions. Each confirmed contact added to the crew's confidence, not in the ocean, but in their own process. And as those small improvements accumulated, the destroyer began to change in subtle ways. Effectiveness, like fatigue, started to compound, only this time it worked in their favor. With each patrol, the ocean began to feel less mysterious. Not safer, but more legible. The destroyer's crew had spent long hours listening to echoes, watching returns shift across the sonar screen, and tracing the invisible movements beneath the surface. Over time, those movements began to form patterns. Submarines did not behave randomly. They turned at certain depths. They slowed when they believed they had shaken pursuit. They changed course in ways that felt cautious, almost predictable. What had once appeared as a single echo in empty water now carried hints of intention. The crew learned to read those intentions the way a tracker reads footprints on land. Repeated encounters reinforced those lessons. A submarine under pressure would often attempt the same kinds of evasive maneuvers, descending sharply, altering course, then leveling out in the hope that the destroyer would overshoot its position. At first, these tactics had confused the escorts. Now, the destroyer's officers began to anticipate them. Instead of reacting to each movement, they started to predict the next one. Sonar operators called out changes with growing confidence. Bridge officers adjusted course not just to follow the contact, but to intercept its likely path. Depth charge patterns were laid with greater precision, arranged to trap the submarine in the space it was expected to occupy, not the space it had just left. Coordination across the ship tightened. Each department understood its role in the sequence. Sonar reported the bearing. The bridge plotted the approach. Engine crews adjusted speed. Depth charge teams prepared the patterns. What had once felt like a series of separate actions began to move as a single, continuous response. Confidence grew, but it was a quiet confidence. There were no speeches about invincibility, no talk of turning the tide. The crew had seen too many false contacts, too many empty explosions, to believe in easy victories. What they trusted instead was the process, the steady refinement of listening, plotting, and striking. Then came another engagement. A contact held steady on sonar. The destroyer moved into position, depth charges prepared in a tighter pattern than before. The charges rolled into the sea, detonating in carefully spaced intervals. The water erupted, then settled again into silence. Sonar listened. No return. The contact was gone. Soon, the surface carried the familiar signs, oil spreading in dark patches, fragments of debris drifting upward. Another submarine had failed to surface. The confirmation came without excitement, just as before. But something about it felt different. The first kill had been treated as an anomaly. This one felt like the result of a method. What had once seemed like coincidence was beginning to resemble a pattern of its own, and the ocean, which had once belonged to the hunter below, was slowly becoming a place where the escort above could strike back with purpose. The second confirmed kill changed the tone of the reports. What had once been described as an anomaly now required explanation. Command officers began to read the destroyer's dispatches more carefully. Sonar contacts, attack runs, confirmations by oil and debris, the pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. Success, instead of being quietly filed away, began to attract scrutiny. Then came the third engagement. The contact appeared at the edge of sonar range, faint but steady. The destroyer moved into position with the practiced rhythm it had developed over days of patrol. There was no dramatic rush, no sense of triumph. Only the sequence, bearing, speed, approach, depth charge pattern. The explosions followed, the sea rose and fell, and the echo disappeared. Oil surfaced hours later, drifting across the waves like a silent confirmation. The fourth came sooner than expected. Fatigue had already begun to weigh on the crew. Watches stretched longer than they felt. Meals were taken quickly, sometimes between sonar sweeps. Sleep came in fragments. The ocean did not offer long periods of quiet, and the ship remained in constant motion, engines humming, sonar pulsing, eyes and ears always searching. When the next contact appeared, there was no energy left for excitement. Only discipline remained. The crew moved through their tasks with the efficiency that comes from repetition. Another attack run. Another sequence of explosions. Another patch of oil spreading slowly across the surface. The fifth engagement followed before the tension could fully settle. By now, the destroyer's presence in those waters had begun to shift the balance. Submarines attempted evasive maneuvers, but their patterns were familiar. What had once felt like a game of chance now resembled a contest of method. The destroyer anticipated, intercepted, and struck with growing precision. Enemy countermeasures lagged behind the reality unfolding at sea. Submarine commanders still operated according to earlier assumptions. Escorts were obstacles, not decisive threats. Their risk calculations had not yet caught up with the destroyer's quiet transformation. Back at command, the reports began to challenge accepted probabilities. One successful engagement could be explained. 2 might be attributed to favorable circumstances. But 3, 4, 5, those numbers demanded reconsideration. The statistics that once favored the submarine were beginning to look less certain. The destroyer itself gained a reputation it had never sought. It was still a small escort, still performing routine duties, but its name began to circulate in briefing rooms and signal reports. Not as a legend, not yet, but as something unusual. A ship that seemed to find submarines where others found only silence. Days passed in that rhythm of vigilance and exhaustion. The patrol continued, the crew growing more tired, more disciplined, and more focused with each engagement. And as the calendar moved forward, the 12th day of the patrol began to approach quietly, without ceremony, as if it carried no significance at all. The 6th contact appeared under less forgiving conditions. Weather had shifted during the night, bringing heavier swells and a restless surface that complicated sonar returns. The ocean no longer spoke in clear echoes. Sound bent and scattered through layers of moving water, turning each contact into a question rather than a certainty. When the signal first appeared, it was faint, barely distinguishable from the background noise. The sonar operator listened again, adjusting the controls, searching for consistency. The echo returned, weak but deliberate. It moved with purpose, not with the drifting irregularity of natural interference. The report reached the bridge, and this time there was no discussion. The crew had performed the sequence too many times to hesitate now. Course adjustments were made almost automatically. Engines shifted tone. Depth charge teams moved into position without being told twice. Procedure had replaced doubt. Below the surface, the submarine followed the logic it had been trained to trust. It altered depth, then turned sharply, hoping to slip away from the destroyer's projected path. It was a textbook evasion, the kind taught in training manuals and reinforced through earlier patrols. In most encounters, such maneuvers bought precious time. Sometimes they saved the vessel entirely. But the destroyer no longer reacted to what the submarine had done. It aimed for what the submarine would have to do next. The depth charge pattern was set with that prediction in mind. Charges rolled into the sea in a tighter formation, their fuses calibrated for a precise sequence of detonations. They did not chase the submarine. They waited for it. The explosions came in heavy, muffled bursts beneath the surface. The sea rose and fell, carrying the shock waves outward. Inside the submarine, the pressure would have been immediate and unforgiving. Metal plates flexed under the force. Rivets strained. Systems faltered. Then came the silence. Sonar listened for the familiar echo, the faint return that would signal survival. There was none. The contact had vanished completely, not through evasion, but through absence. The ocean, as always, closed over the disturbance, smoothing itself back into steady motion. Minutes passed. Then the first signs appeared. Oil surfaced, spreading in dark, irregular shapes. Small fragments followed, bits of debris rising slowly, marking the spot where the submarine had been. Confirmation came quietly. Another submarine was gone. The destroyer continued its patrol, engine steady, crew silent at their stations. There was no celebration, no sense of triumph. Only the quiet understanding that 6 submarines had now disappeared beneath their wake. And somewhere beyond the horizon, Command was beginning to realize that what had once seemed improbable was no longer an accident, it was a pattern that could not be ignored. The first loss reports arrived as absences rather than explanations. A submarine failed to check in at its scheduled time. Another missed a transmission window. At first, such silences did not cause alarm. Patrols were long. Communication was imperfect. Boats occasionally disappeared from the network for hours, sometimes days, before re-establishing contact. But the pattern did not correct itself. More boats failed to report. Messages remained unanswered. Positions that should have been updated stayed fixed on the charts, as if time itself had paused for those vessels. Command officers studied the boards, moving markers, comparing schedules, searching for some simple explanation. At first, coincidence seemed possible. Submarines operated in dangerous waters. Depth charges, aircraft patrols, and mechanical failures all took their toll. Losses were expected. But the clustering of disappearances began to look unusual. Several boats were missing from the same region within the same span of days. Speculation followed. Some officers considered sabotage or mechanical faults. Others suspected an undisclosed Allied tactic, something not yet understood. Intelligence officers reviewed patrol logs, looking for common threads. The answers were incomplete, fragmented across missing reports and unanswered signals. Patrol routes were reassessed. New orders were drafted, suggesting adjustments in operating areas and approach patterns. But the changes came slowly, filtered through layers of communication and confirmation. Submarines already at sea continued their assignments, unaware of the full extent of the losses around them. At the same time, escort capabilities were re-evaluated. Reports from surviving submariners mentioned more aggressive destroyer behavior, quicker reactions, more precise depth charge patterns, less hesitation. The escorts, once dismissed as routine obstacles, were beginning to appear more capable than expected. Confidence began to erode, not through dramatic revelations, but through arithmetic. Each missing boat represented a percentage of the force. One loss could be absorbed. Two could be explained. But as the numbers climbed, the balance shifted. The hunter beneath the surface was no longer operating with the same margin of advantage. Eventually, one detail began to repeat in the reports that did arrive. A particular destroyer's name surfaced again and again, mentioned in brief encounters, in partial transmissions, in the last known positions of several submarines. It was still just a single escort, still small by naval standards, but it was becoming a point of reference. The destroyer had become a named threat. In planning rooms, that realization carried an uncomfortable implication. If one small escort could alter the arithmetic so dramatically, then the assumptions behind their doctrine might not be as solid as they believed. And once a doctrine begins to crack, the numbers that supported it start to look far less certain. At first, the destroyer's record was treated as an anomaly, an unusual cluster of successes in a war defined by uncertainty. Allied command had seen isolated victories before, ships that happened to be in the right place at the right time. But as the reports accumulated, the pattern became harder to dismiss. 6 confirmed submarine kills within a short span of days did not resemble coincidence. The data told a different story. Sonar contacts, approach patterns, depth charge sequences, confirmations by oil and debris, the details repeated themselves with a consistency that defied the language of luck. Each engagement followed a similar logic. Each success emerged from a process that appeared deliberate, not accidental. Analysts began to examine the destroyer's reports more closely. They studied the sonar logs, the timing of attack runs, the spacing of depth charge patterns. What they found was not a secret weapon or a radical invention. It was discipline, careful interpretation of contacts, tighter coordination between departments, and a growing willingness to anticipate submarine maneuvers rather than simply react to them. The conclusions were not announced with ceremony. They circulated quietly in memoranda and training recommendations. Officers discussed them in briefings. Instructors began to emphasize similar approaches in anti-submarine exercises. There was no dramatic declaration of a new doctrine. Just small adjustments repeated across different ships. Other destroyers began to adopt similar techniques. Sonar operators were trained to recognize patterns in submarine evasions. Bridge officers were encouraged to think one move ahead of the contact. Depth charge patterns were tightened, designed not to chase submarines, but to trap them within the limits of their own maneuvering. Anti-submarine warfare began to evolve. It was no longer just a defensive reaction to unseen threats. It became a process structured, deliberate, and increasingly effective. The destroyer's record did not stand alone anymore. It became part of a broader shift, a quiet recalibration of how escorts approached the hunt beneath the waves. For submarines, the ocean started to feel less forgiving. The same depths that once offered concealment now carried risk. Patterns that had worked before were no longer reliable. Escorts reacted faster. Depth charges fell more precisely. The margin for escape narrowed with each encounter. The balance did not shift dramatically or all at once. There was no single battle that marked the turning point. Instead, the change unfolded quietly, across patrols and convoys, across countless hours of listening and maneuvering. Each successful escort engagement added a small weight to the scales. Over time, those weights accumulated. A small destroyer, once considered interchangeable with dozens of others, had shown that the arithmetic of the Pacific could be altered. Not through size or firepower, but through process, discipline, and the steady refinement of routine. And as those lessons spread from ship to ship, the ocean itself began to change character, less a hunting ground for the submarine, and more a place where the hunter could suddenly become the hunted. The reports of missing submarines did not create a single dramatic turning point. There was no moment when the sea itself seemed to change sides. Instead, the shift appeared gradually, measured in adjustments rather than announcements. Patrol orders became more cautious. Submarine deployment slowed in areas where losses had clustered. Commanders began to reconsider the balance between opportunity and risk. The change was subtle, but it was real. Boats that once moved with quiet assurance now operated with a measure of hesitation. Routes were altered. Patrol areas were reassigned. The arithmetic that had once favored the submarine began to look less certain. Each missing vessel represented more than steel and machinery. It represented confidence lost. On the Allied side, the effect moved in the opposite direction. Escort crews began to carry themselves with a different kind of assurance. Not the loud confidence of victory, but the steady belief that the ocean could be managed, listened to, and understood. Anti-submarine tactics felt less like guesswork and more like process. The destroyer's success suggested that discipline could tilt the balance even against an unseen enemy. Shipping losses did not vanish overnight. The Pacific remained vast, and submarines continued to operate across its waters. But the numbers began to shift slowly and unevenly. Convoys reached their destinations more often. Escorts reported more successful engagements. The trend was incremental, almost invisible from one week to the next, but the direction was clear. The destroyer itself did not remain at the center of attention. After its string of successes, it returned to the same duties it had always performed: escorting, patrolling, listening. There were no parades at sea, no ceremonies in the middle of an ocean. The ship's logbook continued to fill with routine entries, bearings, fuel levels, weather conditions, watch rotations. Its impact, however, did not fade with its visibility. Training officers studied the reports. Procedures were adjusted. Sonar techniques were refined. Depth charge patterns were standardized according to the lessons learned during those 12 days. The destroyer's experience became part of a larger institutional memory. Success was absorbed rather than celebrated. The Navy did not frame the event as a singular triumph. Instead, it turned the lessons into procedure, folded them into manuals, and passed them along to other ships. The achievement became less about one vessel and more about what the vessel had demonstrated. War has a way of doing that. It takes individual moments, unexpected successes, quiet experiments, brief clusters of action, and turns them into doctrine. What begins as an anomaly becomes a pattern. What begins as a pattern becomes a standard. In the end, 12 days at sea had not rewritten the war by themselves. But they had altered the assumptions that guided it. And once those assumptions changed, the ocean itself began to feel different to those who moved beneath it. In the language of naval power, size had always carried authority. Larger ships meant heavier guns, thicker armor, longer range, and greater presence. Fleets were measured by tonnage and firepower. Command decisions often revolved around the placement of the biggest vessels, the ones that seemed to define the outcome of a battle before it even began. But the events of those 12 days offered a quieter lesson. A small destroyer, designed for escort duty and rarely mentioned in strategic headlines, had altered the arithmetic of the sea. It had done so without superior firepower, without dramatic innovation, and without the kind of scale that usually defined naval victories. Its effectiveness had come from process, listening carefully, reacting precisely, and refining its methods through repetition. Size, it turned out, was not always the deciding factor. A vessel's purpose, its discipline, and the clarity of its procedures could matter more than the thickness of its armor or the range of its guns. The destroyer had not overwhelmed its opponents through strength. It had outmaneuvered them through understanding. Doctrine, once considered a stabilizing force, revealed its own vulnerability. The assumptions that guided submarine operations had been built on earlier successes. They were logical, structured, and supported by numbers. But they had not accounted for an escort that learned quickly and adjusted its approach. Observation, repeated over days of contact, had quietly undermined a system that once seemed secure. In that sense, the smallest units often drove the greatest adaptations. Large fleets could dominate headlines, but small ships lived closer to the details of war. They listened to the ocean, responded to individual contacts, and adjusted their behavior in real time. Their victories were not always dramatic, but they accumulated, shaping the broader conflict in ways that larger engagements sometimes could not. What emerged from the destroyer's patrol was not spectacle, but discipline. There were no grand fleet battles, no massive exchanges of gunfire. Instead, there were sonar pings, course adjustments, and carefully timed depth charge patterns. The victories came from patience and precision, from a process refined through fatigue and repetition. Innovation, in this context, did not arrive through dramatic invention. It grew under constraint. The destroyer had limited size, limited range, and limited resources. It could not rely on overwhelming force. It had to rely on method. Each engagement forced the crew to learn, to adjust, and to improve. Constraint, rather than limiting their effectiveness, sharpened it. Confidence without curiosity, on the other hand, proved fragile. Submarine commanders had trusted the patterns that had worked before. They had followed procedures that seemed reliable. But when those patterns were challenged, their certainty offered little protection. The ocean, once a place of advantage, became a place of risk. War rarely announces such lessons. It does not pause to explain their meaning. It simply absorbs them. Ships continue to sail. Crews rotate through their watches. The surface of the ocean closes over each engagement as if nothing unusual has occurred. But the sea remembers quietly. It carries the echoes of every depth charge, every sonar pulse, every unseen encounter beneath the waves. And in those echoes lies a reminder that in war, the smallest ships and the smallest adjustments can alter the balance more than anyone expects. History has a habit of counting weight before it counts moments. It records tonnage, armament, and the scale of fleets. Battles are measured by the size of the ships involved and the number of guns they carried. In such records, small vessels often fade into the margins, their names appearing only in lists, their actions summarized in brief lines of text. The destroyer that hunted submarines for 12 days followed that pattern. In the grand ledgers of the war, it did not dominate the headlines. It was not a battleship that changed the outcome of a campaign, nor a carrier that defined an entire theater. Its name appeared in reports, then slowly drifted into footnotes, one entry among many in the vast machinery of naval history. But the lesson it left behind did not fade as easily. Future generations of sailors trained according to procedures shaped by experiences like those 12 days at sea. Sonar techniques grew more refined. Depth charge patterns became more precise. Escorts learned to anticipate rather than merely react. The destroyer's success, once treated as an anomaly, became part of a broader understanding of how the ocean could be controlled. Navies, like history itself, tend to remember outcomes more clearly than the disbelief that precedes them. By the time the lesson was fully absorbed, few remembered how certain commanders had once been that submarines ruled the Pacific or how lightly small escorts had been regarded. The shift appeared gradual, almost inevitable, once it had taken place. What had once been dismissed as routine escort duty had proven decisive. Not through spectacle, but through accumulation. One contact, then another. One confirmed kill, then several more. Each engagement altered the balance slightly until the pattern itself could no longer be ignored. Underestimation had carried a cost. Submarine commanders who once saw destroyers as minor obstacles discovered, too late, that those small ships could become determined hunters. The ocean offered concealment, but it did not guarantee safety. Confidence built on old assumptions proved fragile when confronted by a vessel that learned quickly and acted with discipline. The destroyer itself never changed its nature. It remained small, practical, and bound to escort duty. Its decks carried the same routines, the same watches, the same quiet responsibilities. It did not grow larger or more powerful. It simply proved that effectiveness could come from persistence rather than size. In the years that followed, other ships would achieve greater fame. Larger battles would fill the history books. But somewhere within the quiet procedures of anti-submarine warfare, the memory of the destroyer endured. Not as a legend, but as a lesson. War does not always turn on the largest ships or the loudest battles. Sometimes it shifts because a small vessel refuses to behave as expected. Sometimes the balance changes because one crew listens more carefully, reacts more precisely, and persists longer than anyone predicted. They had never believed one small destroyer could matter. Until 12 days at sea made it undeniable.